We've been looking at the book of Joshua, and we come to a point where the long preparations for the conquest of the promised land are now coming to an end. The people would need to consecrate themselves spiritually to the undertaking, but another of the tasks was sending the spies out into the land. And it was a rather perilous thing because the people of Jericho knew that they were on the other side of the Jordan. They had heard all kinds of things about them, and we'll touch on that in a moment. And so sending the spies into the land was not going to be easy. Besides that, we're told later on that the Jordan was in flood stage, so the spies probably went up further north to cross at a different place, went all the way out to the west and went into the hill country, and then came down from the west, hoping to get into the city without being recognized as Israelites. It appeared like they were going to make it, but somebody must have seen them. They went, as many merchants would, to the house of a prostitute. And we can't do anything but understand that the word that is being used here is that this is a woman of the night. But it was not unusual for travelers to stay in the houses of prostitution. They were, in many respects, better places to stay than in many of the inns. In any case, they thought they had gotten away with it, but the king's people had seen them come in. They thought that they had gotten caught, and then Rahab, the prostitute, does something totally remarkable. She hides them. She lies for them. And that's one of the things that we're going to take a look at. This woman who you would not expect to becomes one of the pillars of faith that is talked about in the 11th chapter of Hebrews and also talked about in James chapter 2 as an example of faith. The unexpected sometimes are used by God in glorious ways. This faith is an example for all who have true faith, and it was three important components: the works which demonstrated it, the nature and development, and its wonderful benefits. Let's start, first of all, with the work of faith. Verses 4 and 5 make it very clear that her first work of faith actually revolved around a lie. And one of the things we have to grapple with here is the Bible saying lying is okay? And I think we have to come down and say, no, it isn't. But we also have to understand that Rahab is coming from a point in life where she doesn't know some of the things that are right. She is responding out of faith, and sometimes faith has a funny way of coming out of very unexpected places. People you're not expecting, things you're not expecting. We're told that some of the saints, like Abraham, told lies, but Scripture uniformly condemns falsehood. And Christ, of course, was not someone who lied. However, Rahab's lies show that element of faith that is so evident. The lessons she leads us are many, but one we should particularly keep in mind is that we must be sympathetic and patient with recent converts. John Newton, the author of Amazing Grace and other hymns, and an early church leader in the evangelical movement in the Church of England, continued to participate into the slave trade for over a year after he became a Christian. And many Christians, when they first come to Christ, have areas of their lives that take a while to overcome. Sometimes a person has come to Christ and is an alcoholic or a drug addict, and it takes a while to get themselves clear from the problems that they have. Sometimes it takes a person a while to get their relational life in order. We are reminded time after time that sometimes God works sequentially. one thing after another has to fall into place to change in people's lives. It's not that they stay there. It's the fact that it takes a while for people to change. There's a lot of bad habits and sins to be overcome. Often sins are salted with faith, and God finds faith where we would not normally expect it. The classic symbol which revealed Ahab's great faith was the scarlet cord that was to be hung from her window in the wall of Jericho. Verses 18 through 20 record how the two spies promised her safety if she would display the cord in the window. Now, one of the interesting things here is down through the years, many church leaders have talked about that scarlet cord in ways that are rather allegorical, and I'm not sure that you could go as far in some of the things they've said about it as they have gone, finding symbols of Christ in ways that may not be quite appropriate, at least to our way of thinking. But one thing we can see is that scarlet cord was probably caught up in the idea of the Passover. There's a similarity. It had occurred 40 years before this event. The people of Israel had been told to slay a lamb, to take its blood and put it on the doorposts, and then all the families were to stay within their home so that the angel of death would pass over them when they saw those markings. In the same way, that scarlet cord was serving as a marker to the people of Israel that this was a home that needed to be left alone and the people not killed. We're going to be coming to communion this morning. And in the same way, the Passover was a symbol of what was going to come with the Lord's Supper and what Christ would have happened through his life, death, and resurrection. So God often uses symbols in our lives. The Apostle James, in the 2nd chapter of his letter, tells us that true faith produces works. He gives two examples, Abraham and Rahab. He talks about Abraham being willing to sacrifice his son, and he uses Rahab as a good example of faith, even though it was just the beginnings of faith. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Now we might ask, how in the world is faith formed? How in the world did Rahab get the kind of faith that we see take place here? An early 20th century Bible scholar by the name of Abraham Kuyper talks about the fact that the houses of ill repute, if you want to put it that way, of this culture were often the places where the merchants would first go. And the fact is, she probably had heard for a long time from some of these travelers from afar that there was a people out there that amazing things were happening with. And for some reason, the people of Jericho also were beginning to talk about these people. They had heard these stories. They were fearful. This was not a tribe you would have expected to have been overpowering or people being concerned about. But the fact is, they were. Something was going on with these people, and they were fearful. And then we also have what we might say is the times where those spies are with her. She may very well have seen them treat her in a way that was very different than most of the people who came to her establishment. They were moral people, and maybe they had talked about their God in certain ways. She saw something different. It is a reminder to each and every one of us that people are often watching the way we are living our lives. They're listening to how we talk and how we respond to the situations in our lives. And they might very well say, you know, that person is different than I expected. One of the things we have to deal with here is that we know very well that Jericho was one of the oldest of the fortified cities. It was a supposedly invincible city, and yet God was going to overcome something that should have stopped the people of Israel. And again, that'll be something we deal with in the future. You never know where faith can be found, and you never know where faith might change someone's life. Many of you are familiar with the story of Charles Colson, who had described himself as a very ambitious and high-powered politician who really had earned the political term of being a henchman. He was a hatchet man. He would do anything to further his goals in his politics. And yet when God got a hold of him, he became the epitome of Christ, becoming someone through whom a whole society of the prison world seemed to be touched, in a ministry that changed many of the conditions and in our jails, and also changed the lives of many, many people. One of the things we see is that there's hope, no matter where. That God can get a hold of a life and transform it. Even lives that seem to be very lost in sin. Now we take a look at faith's rewards. Rahab's faith garnered 3 rewards. First, Israel was encouraged. Verses 23 and 24 show how positively the people of Israel were hearing the words of the spies, how the people of Jericho were afraid of them. You know, sometimes just knowing that some of our opponents have their weaknesses or have their own fears allows us to be more bold. The second thing is Rahab's faith was her own salvation and her family's in 2 ways. Initially, it was a physical salvation. They were rescued from the invasion. But then it would be a spiritual salvation. The third reward of Rahab's faith may be spoken of as her glorification. And here her story takes a really unusual tact. We find out in Numbers 7 that Rahab not only lived the rest of her life in Israel, but she married an Israelite who became an ancestor of Jesus Christ. She herself was an ancestor of Christ. Her father-in-law was one of the leaders of the Israelites, and her husband would take his father's place as a leader. And we see that there are many people who get a little bit nervous about Rahab appearing in the genealogy of Matthew for Jesus. And it's a reminder that when God gets a hold of a life, it doesn't matter what has happened in the past. Now, I'll just say this as an aside. Many of the scandals that keep on rocking our society have to do with what people have done in the past. And I don't want to minimize that, but take a look at the fact that people don't stay the way they once were. Someone might have been a racist 30 years ago, but they are no longer a racist now. Someone might have been a fallen man or woman 30 years ago, but Christ has redeemed them now. Too often we hold people's past against them and forget that when God comes into somebody's life, there is often great transformation. And this is good news for each and every one of us, because none of us is perfect. As one commentator said, remember, even the Virgin Mary, who also ends up in the genealogies, was not sinless, in spite of what the Catholic Church thinks. All of us are sinners, saved by the blood of Christ. Our past can be forgiven. It can be renewed. There are new possibilities. God can be at work in our lives in powerful ways, and that's a reminder to us. Don't underestimate who God is going to use in your life. God might bring somebody along in your life that is the least likely to help you, at least in your eyes, only to discover that they are of immense help. Hebrews 11:33 tells us Rahab was saved by faith. James 2:25 says it was by works. And there's no contradiction here, because what James means is you have to put your faith into action. There is no such thing as just having an intellectual faith that does not affect the way you live your life. And that needs to be a challenge to each and every one of us. As we come to the table of the Lord this morning, we need to be reminded of the fact that what Christ did on the cross of Calvary for us needs to be lived out in a way in our lives that touches the lives of other people. As I said before, there may be someone looking at us, watching how we live our lives, noticing that there's something different about us. Maybe we don't react to certain situations the way they would expect. Maybe we're kind to even those who have bullied us or been mean to us. And suddenly they begin to realize there might be something different out there. Christ wants to get in the door of people's hearts. And getting into the door of people's hearts might have to do with how we live our lives, the lives we touch, the actions we show.